I think as a field, that's one place where we do struggle, is showing how good the work is that we do. We know we do good work, but if you have to sell it to someone, it's very hard to sell that this person has a great life. Providers are doing everything in their power to create more efficient operations, and then they're doing that, and it often seems as though the regulators and government bodies are just layering on more administrative burden. You can kind of see the glimmer, and you see the green shoots in folks that are just natural leaders, and people tend to flock to them. So what I found was bringing those folks into the fold early on, when you do see that potential, really makes a difference.
Welcome to IDD Leader, where human services leaders grow their impact, lead with heart, and build the workplaces our field deserves. I'm your host, Nate Beers. Let's dive in. Did you ever wonder what other providers are struggling with or dealing with that maybe they're not even saying out loud? Or maybe you're looking for some sparks of innovation or some inspiration around best leadership practices and how to shift certain stuck spots in the culture at your organization. If any of those apply to you, I think you're going to really enjoy today's conversation. It is part 2 of an interview with Tim Sohosky. He is the IDD director at a state provider association in Pennsylvania. And even if you didn't catch part 1, you can just jump in right here. I think you'll be able to follow along just fine. Or if you want to look at the previous episode, it would be the last one that was released before this one. You can catch the first half there. Regardless, you're going to hear a lot of very practical strategies, moves that you could start to make even this week to move things in the right direction. At your organization, you may just feel encouraged and inspired. There are things that are working well, and there's innovation that's coming that it will make your job and life easier. We'll get a nice bird's eye view from what Tim sees as he's in conversations with organizational leaders as a full-time job. I mean, all the time he's in those conversations, and also back and forth with state leaders and representatives as well. So anyhow, you're going to get a ton of value out of this episode, I am sure. So without further ado, enjoy today's conversation. From talking with you before, I understand that RCPA collaborates closely with 2 other provider associations in Pennsylvania. Tell me a little bit about what that looks like, or what gets added. I'm sure some of our listeners are in PA. There's plenty. There's a lot more probably outside of PA, and I don't know how many other states have multiple provider associations, but I'm sure PA is not the only one. What's valuable for that? What value gets added when there's multiple associations, and what does that collaboration look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And go back to another analogy similar to the puzzle analogy. In this one, I would say this is almost like running a race. So we have multiple folks out on the track, and we're hopefully all going in the same direction, but some of us are going fast, some are going slow. Maybe there are some people that didn't even start yet. And, those people, each one being an association. And so at some point or another, we need to all get going on the same speed, which would be our messaging or how we're sharing information. Because what ends up happening when you're not collaborating, it opens up some cracks that can be exploited. And I hate to say that elected officials or state representatives would do that, but it's very easy to say to someone, for example, well, I talked to Tim at RCPA and he told me this. And then I went over and talked to another association and they told me something very different. Which one is it? And you can almost triangulate people against themselves then. So what we found is that by collaborating very closely, and when I say close collaboration, we talk multiple times a week as associations. So there's a huge amount of overlap there and a lot of communication that occurs just to make sure that we're sharing what we know, because a lot of times we have membership meetings or maybe we're invited to a legislative event or whatever, and not all of us go at the same time. But it's really nice to know that if someone from another association was at some type of legislative breakfast, for example, and heard something, they can share that with us, and then we can all sort of message around that. We can prepare for it, and we're not doing separate things or duplicative work, things like that. And then the other thing that's really important with it is all the associations have sort of their, what I'll say, preferred legislators that they deal with. and they have real deep relationships with their, maybe, like in my example, I'm very close with my senator where I live at. So, that's a relationship that's strong there, where maybe someone else doesn't have that relationship with him. So when things come up with him, I would be the contact there, and I can preserve that relationship during the turnover, because as much as we talk about turnover in terms of staff and providers, there's a lot of turnover in the legislature too. So you always have new people coming in, and you're very often starting from step one when you're explaining our needs, what our asks are. So if you have folks in the associations that have relationships from prior work, maybe they worked in these, they were a staffer with this legislator or senator, whatever. Uh, those relationships can continue, and you get some of that continuity. So you're not always telling the story from page one all the time. You can sort of keep things where they're at as they occur, and that collaboration is a big piece of that. So we can sort of lean on each other as associations. Hey, this is happening. This person's sponsoring this bill. You have a good relationship with him, her. Give them a call. Let them know we're concerned about this, and then they return the favor on some other bill where it's in their home district or someone they have a close relationship with. So I think that's the big piece of it.
Okay. Along those lines, how does a concern you might hear from a provider actually make its way into like a real advocacy priority?
So typically, what will happen is we'll get a call, an email, outreach some way, saying, "I was told," or "I had this happen to me. What do you know about this?" And it may be something that is already on our radar, or it can be something completely out of left field. So what I'll normally do then is, and this is pretty common across the associations, is we'll reach out to various members, maybe people in the same region or in the same line of business in that region, and say, "Hey, are you hearing this? What's your experience with this?" And 9 times out of 10, what one provider is experiencing, those other folks are experiencing too. So we'll pull together, maybe it's a work group, even just a quick discussion, a stand-up meeting. Let's talk about this issue and what this is impacting. And then how much wider does it go? So is it just, where I'm at in Schuylkill County, for example, something weird is happening here. Is it only this county, or is it all of the counties? And then from there, we can start working on what the issue is, developing proposed solutions, because I think that's a big piece of the advocacy puzzle. Is if you just go there to complain and say this doesn't work without offering any type of other fallback and solution to the problem, probably not going to get a lot of things done. So, creating that with that work group, and then taking that to whichever respective area. If it's a regulatory issue, we may just go right to ODP with that and say, we have 25 providers experiencing this issue with this regulation. Can we talk about that? And ODP, like I said before, I love to give them credit where it's due. They're always very responsive to things like that. When we reach out with those issues, they're open to talking. They can't always change things. We get that. So if it's something that they can't change, or maybe they won't change, but it needs to be changed, then we'll shift courses and we will go the regulatory or the legislative route, where then you start reaching out to elected officials and telling them, hey, your constituents have a big issue with whatever the issue is. We'd like you to support this. And sometimes it's just a letter from an elected official that they'll sign on to saying, hey, department, we think you should change this. Uh, and then the change will occur. They'll get some middle ground there. And then other times it goes through a whole legislative process, hearings, votes, and it's actually a bill that's passed. So it can go a couple different ways, but typically it starts with one person reaching out and saying, I don't agree with this, or this is making my life crazy. I really need this to change. And, that kind of starts the wheels rolling then.
That's no, that's really cool to kind of hear like to track it, the process of how it goes through. Um yeah, no, that's cool to hear about.
I guess I should qualify that process could be a couple of months to like decades. So,
It can take
but
a
I don't
long
want to make it
time.
sound like it's a phone call
No.
away to make things change.
Well, no and yes though, but the yes of that is make the call, right?
Sure,
Because without
absolutely,
that, who's going to know and how is change going to happen?
for sure.
A lot of actually that's been almost like a recurring theme in what you're sharing is that there's a lot that can be done with the right targeted actions, whether we're trying to tackle high vacancy and turnover, or whether we're trying to, deal with some kind of difficult regulation or something like that, that there's a lot that can be changed. And I'm finding that very encouraging and very hopeful. I'm curious, what are providers dealing with that they often don't say out loud, but that you can kind of pick up on it over and over again?
I would say the overarching theme in almost every conversation that we have is providers are doing everything in their power to create more efficient operations, whether that be through technology, AI use, uh, EHRs, anything that can create more efficiency. And then they're doing that, and it often seems as though the regulators and government bodies are just layering on more administrative burden. So it seems like every time you get a win as a provider where you say, you know what, I can repurpose this person over here to do something else. We don't need to do those spreadsheets anymore. A month or two later, a year later, something comes out where, I have to pull that person back and we need to do other spreadsheets now. So it's almost like this cat and mouse game where you're trying to create as efficient operation as possible. So you're using your resources in a responsible manner. And then there's this layer of administrative burden that may be well intended and maybe has a reason that it has to occur, but it's often not well explained, that sort of squashes those efficiencies that you create. And you get, you constantly sort of a tug of war with it.
Yeah. I think I even heard that in something you were sharing earlier, where like a lot of the stronger providers, they often are not very top heavy, right? Because they're trying to be a little bit more lean or agile to be able to have higher paid frontline staff and to be able to, these kinds of things. And then at the same time, to stay on top of whether it's performance based contracting or whatever other new regulation or legislation that's coming down the pipeline, often takes more admin. It takes more of actually the support staff. It's there, and and sometimes you're just trying to prove what you're already doing, like it's already being done. You just have to be able to show it in lots of different ways. But I hear that there's really can be a tension on those two things. And I think I think that can be a tricky spot to be in if you're trying to kind of satisfy both sides of that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And from a CEO or executive director perspective, where you may have a board who is pushing you to be more efficient and implement the latest technology or whatever the latest solutions are, it's a can be a touchy conversation to have with those folks, and it can be contentious where you're getting a direction from the board saying do this, and you're saying I want to, but I need that extra admin person. Well, you don't, because we just gave you AI support, or we bought a better subscription to something. And that can be tough to navigate. And we hear it often, and in different scenarios. It's not always just like, I don't want to make it sound like it's just technology and that's the only thing that struggles with that. You can always use your resources in better ways when you're not just pushing paper around because, like you said, someone says you have to prove that you're doing something. That's not a great use of time usually when you're doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I recognize that tension too, just from my background, which is in behavior analysis, which is a very data-driven field, right? We're creating data around behavior, which is something that most people don't really think like necessarily. Data and behavior don't outside of behavior analysis. I don't think that people usually put those together. And there's kind of this. I mean, I think that tension is real uh, in a lot of different places where you actually want to be making informed decisions that aren't just sort of based on intuition or based on what seems good, but where there's actually, data backing it up. Like, let's suppose we tried, did the sign-on bonuses work? Well, if we don't have good data to track it, we actually don't know if that did make a difference on our, vacancy rate. I mean, we might still see the rate, but we might know that percentage, but until we actually do an analysis, well, did this X number of dollars make a difference if we did versus another one, or did it make no difference whatsoever? So there really is value in both. There's value in being able to know the numbers and to be able to see what's working, but then also trying to push towards efficiency so that we're not just kind of re-going over the same stuff over and over again, or doing it in a way that's not really very efficient in the first place.
I think that raises a good point as well, and sort of going back to not just the operational data, but also the outcomes data for folks. And I'm sure being in behavior analysts, you want to know what outcomes you want and which outcomes you don't want. And I will say that is something that in my role now is the biggest consistently inconsistent thing that we see is the outcomes that folks are working on. And obviously they're going to have variance because it's going to be person-centered planning and not everybody's going to work towards the same outcomes. But we do see a lot of very varied things, and it makes you call into question, is this actually meaningful for that person? Is this something that they want to do? Is it something that they need to do? Is it a health issue, safety issue? And there's not a whole lot of really good data that supports those outcomes yet. And I think as a field, that's one place where we do struggle is showing how good the work is that we do. We know we do good work, but if you have to sell it to someone, it's very hard to sell that this person has a great life. Well, define that. Okay, well, they go to the mall 3 times a week. Well, I don't know if that's a great life, then great. We check that box 3 times and Tim's living his best life. Or we didn't check it at all this week and I'm not doing well. And they're the types of things that I think we see. And I think as a whole system, we need to move towards better visibility into what those outcomes are and really how do you track them? And it's not just checking boxes and counting how many times something happened or didn't happen. It's a little subjective, which obviously doesn't really work well with data. But it's something that I see very consistently is that providers, they struggle with making that illustration, graphic illustration, however you want to describe it, of the work that they do. And it kind of goes back even to the videos where I was saying, you see someone out having a great day, they're at some type of community event or whatever. Uh, how do you put that into a number and then have that somewhere quantifiable and that someone who maybe doesn't know anything about the field could look at it and say, this is a good provider. I'm looking at their data. This is great. Because I feel like where we're at now is a lot of very incident heavy data. So you're great at you're awesome. You have no incidents. Okay, well that may be a good data point. I mean, something to be proud of. Uh, but at the same time, maybe I serve the most chronically needy individuals and I have a ton of incidents, but I serve them very well. And I'm also very conscientious about reporting my incidents. So, that transparency and just the visibility to folks outside of the system, I think is something that is still a little bit of a struggle and something that we all need to work to improve.
That's a really great point. When I met and interviewed Dr. Peter Gerhardt, who's like an executive director in New Jersey, and one of the things he pointed out was if there's learning, it's going to be messy. The only time you're going to have like no incidents, no issues is if like no risks were being taken whatsoever. It's the child that never learns to walk doesn't get that experience of falling down when they're learning to walk. And that's, I think, a pretty good metaphor for if we're trying to push the envelope a little bit with either who we're saying yes to helping to provide supports to, like some of the more complex needs individuals, or if we're just even with whoever we have in our programming, if we're allowing them and encouraging, not for someone that doesn't want to. I mean, maybe if they're 75 years old and they're at this point just kind of in those golden years, like no, maybe that's not the moment that they want to be trying a ton of new experiences. But I think it can be real easy. I think the system can almost reinforce or encourage the 25-year-old, let's not take any risks because there'll be no incidents, you know? Whereas actually what would be good is if we did push the envelope. What if we did give enough space for there to be, for mistakes to be made? Not the wrong kind of mistakes, but you know what I'm saying? Like the right kind. And I think you're absolutely right about that. And just like, I think a chronic challenge can be, it's easier to measure pathology. It's easier to measure incidents. It's easier to measure problems just in general than let's measure happiness and freedom and um, self-advocacy. Like those are much harder to put numbers on than hospitalizations or, incident reports or things like that. But that's a really great point that you brought up.
Yeah, I think all of that data can really paint a picture, and the more that we can kind of incorporate all of that into how providers are, what I'll say, graded, uh, the better. And of course, we don't want to just throw everything out in terms of the negativity and the incidents and whatnot. They're very important data points, but I think we could do a better job systemically in capturing some of that other data now. How that looks and the tools that we capture that with, I'll defer to you on that one.
Oh,
But I
come
think
on,
there's,
Tim. That's for you to figure. Isn't that your job title somewhere, or job description
uh,
somewhere, that you're going to solve the system?
yep, continuous quality improvement, right? That's what we need to rely on there.
Yeah. Okay. What are some sparks of innovation that you're seeing, or that
So a
you have
couple of
seen?
things, few things that are really interesting lately. Uh, I'm sure in some of the previous interviews you've touched on this is the merger and acquisition going on across the field. I was actually just on a call right before we got on here, and there was a very large discussion about how in Utah providers are kind of stratifying into very, very small providers and very, very large providers, and there's no middle-sized providers anymore. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. That folks are leveraging efficiencies of scale. I was at a conference not too long ago where there was actually a mergers and acquisition presentation, and something that caught my eye and my ear was, it was just sort of very, you would think that, yeah, that's common sense, but it's really costs a lot of money to pay 3 or 4 or 5 CEOs, COOs, CFOs. So as you're merging and acquiring, and you can roll those folks under one person, there's a lot of dollars that can be saved and redeployed out into DSP wages, home improvements, vehicles, things like that. So I do see a lot there, and that's not anything new, but I think it's kind of new to the IDD field. Typically, with the IDD field, there were a lot of small providers, typically started as mom and pops, nonprofits, and slowly they're starting now to sort of gel together. And we're seeing it on our end from the association. There's a lot of M&A activity out there right now that is underway, and I think the big piece there is, while it does create the efficiencies, the folks that we've seen do it really well keep that original mission, vision, and values of the acquired association when one associate or one provider is buying another provider. There's some really talented management teams out that can lead that and keep that feeling that the company didn't really change. It's just it's a paper change, but our mission is still there. We're still supporting the individuals. I think that's a lot of the success that we're seeing there. And then outside of M&A, I think the other thing that's really that we're seeing that's pretty cool, and probably seen more demos of AI technology than I'd like to this year. It seems like there's new products coming on the market all the time, but some really cool stuff. And it's not just the EHR, let me write your notes for you AI. It's things that are directly supporting individuals. So you have an individual, they have a smartphone, an iPad, tablet, whatever. What are the tools that you can put on there so they can communicate better, so that they can go about their day with less people having to stand behind them and say, hey, don't forget, close the refrigerator door, or, oops, you know what, brush your teeth. I mean, there's some neat tools out there. And I actually had a conversation with an OT who has a really nice presentation put together. Even like interactive toothbrushes that show you where you brushed your teeth at. Did you miss any spots? Did you brush long enough? Things like that. Very small things, but things that can free up a couple of minutes at a time of a staff person's time. And all of a sudden, that staff person has an extra hour in their day or week, whatever that may be, to do something that's a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more fun with the individual. So I see that as a lot of what's out there in terms of the innovation. And it seems like we're at a trajectory now that is almost straight up and down in terms of the rate of new things coming onto the market. It seems like every day there's some new product coming in out there. So it's neat that it's starting to enter into our field. And then, of course, all the other electronic health records, things like that, I think will also save a ton of time. But one thing that I really saw that I wanted to highlight here with this is uh, a lot of scheduling tools and payroll tools are now starting to implement AI into their scheduling. So it's taking your schedule for your group home, for example, and it's saying, we know you're short staffed, but if you move, Nate into this schedule and Tim into that schedule, and maybe we split a schedule, see if that'll work for them. It'll save time, and maybe we don't have to hire another person there, and we can cover all those shifts. So it's neat to see that actually coming forth. was talked about for many years, and sort of you saw some really rudimentary demos, but now it seems like it's really coming into its own. And uh, that you could see that providers are starting to leverage that because with the staffing shortages, whether they're chronic or not chronic, I think anything that can optimize your schedules is going to be a good solution.
Wow, that's cool. We can only imagine where some of this stuff's going to lead us in another 5 or 10 years. I mean, even just, I mean, the difference of like how fast things are moving. It's ridiculous, and and uh, and yeah, it's cool though to see how technology is allowing people to live more independently, and being able to accomplish things that either they couldn't accomplish before or that were just much more time intensive to see that shifting. And then what you shared about the schedules as well, that's pretty cool. um with software that's helping to solve staffing issues, that's a neat prospect.
For sure, yeah, I think that's something that's going to really make an impact in the field, and it's going to be something that's going to be an immediate impact when it comes online, and uh, looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, I want to bring it back to something that I am personally very passionate about, and I see this as as uh, a common challenge. You shared your own passion and interest in seeing other people succeed, like that. Good leadership looks like you have not just the people right below you, but even the people below them that are coming up, that are they're getting more skillful, they're getting more equipped, they're handling things better than they ever were before. This kind of stuff. A lot of times, I think anybody would say what we see is with a great leader, they'll usually surround themselves with a great team, but to replicate that to the next level below can be pretty challenging. Um, like the people around, I don't know if I'm saying this clearly. The people around them might come up, but to replicate their replicating is where it gets really tricky, or can be harder to do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that from, and any of your experience or kind of your take on all that.
Yeah, I will say I was very fortunate with my organization prior that they funded me to have a professional development coach for about 6 months, and that was kind of midway through my career, I'll say. So some way, somebody somewhere looked and said, "I think Tim has potential. We want to get this set up." And there was a couple of my coworkers that were also chosen for that program, and that was huge. That ability to have that coach, and it was pretty intensive. It was multiple conversations a week, some weeks, uh, assignments that you had to do. It wasn't just tell me what's wrong and I'll help you solve your problems. It was really
Yeah,
impactful, and it was very much tailored to what was going on in the moment. It wasn't just a general, here's how to be a good manager or listen to people, things like that. So anything like that I think can be brought forth. And then again, not in that level of, not that C-suite level, and maybe not even the level below them, but really looking and saying, this person is a great leader. And I think we all know by looking at people that they'll be a good leader. There's just some things, and it's very hard to put your finger on too. It's not something that you can say you have A, B, and C, therefore you will be the next CEO. But you can kind of see the glimmer, and you see the green shoots in folks that are just natural leaders, and people tend to flock to them. And even if they're not in a position of authority, they have that informal authority where if you can get them on your side, you can make a lot of changes. And so what I found was bringing those folks into the fold early on when you do see that potential really makes a difference. And I have a gentleman who sticks in my mind. He was a direct care worker, direct support professional, was going to school, but you could tell he had the right qualities. He was well spoken. He was just you could tell looking at him. He did that, and as he progressed up through the chain of command, it was almost this no brainer of, let's pull him into this meeting, or he's typically not part of this leadership team, but let's he's going to sit next to me in this meeting and provide some feedback from a different level. And you can frame it all different ways, because I think one thing that you need to be cautious with there is people get a little defensive of their turf. And it's, hey, I've worked here 15 years and Tim was only here 5 years, why is he at this meeting? Or how come he's doing this? So it's, as a leader, you have to navigate that, and kind of manage some personalities now and then, but really doing that with the folks, and then encouraging even the staff underneath them to do that. So if you have a house supervisor, for example, is there some way that you can delegate some tasks to someone to kind of prep them to take your job as you move up? And hopefully that would be the reason why you're leaving. If you're getting a promotion and now that person's moving into your role. And we've seen a lot of good success with that. I think the really effective agencies have that, and some of them have it really locked down to the point where this is a very written plan and there's manuals and uh, very, step one, step two, step three. Others are much less formal, but they get to the same point where you're identifying those folks early on. You're bringing them in, giving them tools that they need to succeed. Um, Maybe you hook them up with a mentor. I think that's something that I've been privileged enough to do throughout my career, was mentor some folks, and that can take a variety of different ways. What that looks like, it can be very formal or it can be informal, and that creates that depth in that bench, though, so that when you are stepping out or stepping up, whichever way it's going, that someone is there to step into your role, and hopefully it will be fairly seamless. I think the other thing that's important when we're talking about, executive level folks, is having a long runway for transition. That it really shouldn't be I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice, see you later type of thing. I was actually just at an event not too long ago for someone who retired after a very long career, and her transition was 3 years out of her role, and it was great, hearing how that went and all the planning that went into that, and how they identified someone early on who was going to step in and be the next CEO, and then working side by side for that an extended amount of time. So it wasn't that it's just a very, cold handoff where here's the keys to the office. I'll be in to get my stuff tomorrow type of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, so giving yourself that runway, I think all of those things are really something that can build that bench. And then the biggest piece of it too is, I think, identifying the folks that are there for the mission. And that's a big piece. There's people that want to get promoted because they think it's more money, and hopefully it is. But there's also folks there that really want to advance their career in terms of how many more lives can I impact? What more can I do to better the agency, better my community? Whatever their focus is. But if it aligns with the company's mission, it makes it a lot easier to identify those people.
Wow, you just that was a lot. I mean, you just said it like I think if I had to break it down, I had like 4 or 5 really good points that you just brought out with that. Yeah, no, that's a lot. That's some good things to reflect on. I'd like to kind of end with one last question. What are you hoping will be different, I guess, at this statewide or whatever, a little bit more the macro. Okay, yes, obviously the job classification, that's super macro, but I guess so somewhere between that federal level and the provider level, what are you hoping that if things are always changing, but where do you hope things are different 5 or 10 years from now?
I think taking a long horizon like that, looking at where we are today, we're in a very unique situation, and not to make it political, but we're in an atmosphere where the government is cutting regulations very quickly with not a lot of pushback on them. Um, and I think that for providers, that can be beneficial, that we can kind of shape things in the next few years, 5 years, starting today, where we have regs that make sense, that they're one contemporary, that a lot of the regulations that we operate under haven't been updated in decades. So if there's things there that don't make sense anymore, let's get rid of them now while we have this window of opportunity where you have both federally, well, mainly federally, but some on the state levels as well. I'm not just looking at Pennsylvania. There's also some states that are taking a chainsaw potentially to their regulations. Let's capitalize on that and make this an environment where folks are always safe. They have great outcomes, good clinical quality, but we're rewriting those regulations to make better sense and better support the providers to be successful. So it's not so much of this gotcha game, or it's there's some mundane thing that really doesn't affect anybody's livelihood, but somewhere along the way it became a regulation. We'll get rid of those. And then, the other thing on a longer horizon is really protecting the funding that we have now. I know we didn't really get into rates or funding, and hopefully that was intentional, because it's a topic that everybody wants to talk about, but it's it's beat to death often. But we really do need to look ahead as CMS and states. More so, it starts with CMS. So on the federal level, um, I get the feeling like tomorrow, if everyone could just turn the lights off at CMS, I think they would and just say, states, handle this yourselves. We're not going to do this at a federal level anymore. You take care of your needs. Uh, something's going to change there. Maybe not that dramatic, but there's going to be reductions in funding potentially, and that's going to fall onto the states to make up. So how do states do that, and how do we protect the funding that we fought so hard to get all these years? Uh, for the first time in a long time, we're hearing of, cuts in services, and states are going to have to make a very tough decision and say, you know what, we can't afford this program, or this program doesn't have outcomes. And this is going back to that original comment I made about the outcomes, where I think we're vulnerable there in that I'll speak to Pennsylvania specifically. When you look at DHS's budget, ODP is a huge portion of that, and it has virtually, non-existent outcomes data where the other departments can say, if you come to outpatient in this service, there's a 30% likelihood that you will approve in a year. Where when you look at ODP services, it's like, we give people a good life. And, that's, if you're there with the red pen in a budget season, that doesn't sell you on, spending more money there. So I think there's a real risk there 5 or 10 years out. Again, things can change, elections happen, and maybe it takes a different course after the midterms next year. But that's where we're looking at this point, is really how do we protect what we have and make sure that we're not heading backwards towards institutionalization or state centers, things like that, because it's been a long fight to get rid of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Tim, it's been a pleasure. I'm so thankful for your time with me today, and I'm sure every listener's probably gained a lot of insight from the things you've shared. So thank you so much.
I appreciate your time.
Wow, that was like another boatload of insights and wisdom. I hope you enjoy hearing from these guests as much as I do. Listen, I always leave you with some kind of next step, an action move that you can take. And this is along the lines of what I said last week. But I want to encourage you, ask for help. There's no reason something needs to stay stuck. One of the biggest conversations that I have over and over again, and I heard this in what Tim was sharing as well, is that there are resources available, ways to get problems solved that often involve going to outside resources to get that kind of help. Even the whole nationwide staffing shortage, not every organization is experiencing that. There are large, small, mid-sized organizations that have low turnover, low or zero vacancies, and are just crushing it with their staff retention and recruitment. It's not happening on accident, but it's not because, oh, they're so special, or, oh, they're in another state or another setting. It's because of intentional decisions they're making. And so any area that's feeling stuck, get the help that you need. And there's zero shame in that. As leaders, I know it can feel uncomfortable. I'm not just saying that. Like I can think of multiple examples in my own life where it was uncomfortable to ask for certain types of help, but that is where the resources are, is when we ask for help. So certainly start by asking for help with your state provider association if there's an issue that's come up or something that needs to get adjusted in policy or legislation or anything like that. But then also, my whole goal is that IDD Leader, the podcast itself, but also the kind of the business behind it, is a help and a resource to you. I've got a free one that you can pick up at iddleader.com/burnout. And it talks about the 7 quiet danger signs that your supervisors are burning out their teams. If you want to pick it up, it's a free PDF assessment. You can take it in 3 minutes and sort of see how your organization stacks up. It also points to the solutions for those. So not just kind of wallowing in, wow, yeah, we've got a little bit of an issue here, but also pointing right towards solutions. Regardless, I just want to see you thrive. Nothing brings me more joy than seeing you thrive as an organization and seeing your workforce thrive. So I hope you'll take advantage of the many, many resources that are right around you and can be at your fingertips. Well, I can't wait to see next week when we come back together again. But until next time, here's to you. Keep up the amazing work.